Mac, welcome to Remote Talks. It would be great if we could start, if you could introduce yourself.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm Mac. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Commsor, and we're building the community operating system. I'll keep it very high level for the
No, I'm gonna ask you right away. What does it mean?
It's a short version. I think it's it's kind of like what HubSpot is to a marketing team or Salesforce is to a sales team. We are building for a community team. It's this idea that community is this whole network of engagement around companies. It's not just their Slack channels or their forums, but it's all these touch points, social media, email newsletters, events, Slacks, forums. And the core of our product is taking all that, tying it together, giving community teams a system of record. We call it a CNM, a community network manager instead of a CRM, and then building the tooling to help them better engage their community, better understand their community, and then connect that community back to other functions in the company so they can understand the impact community has on sales, marketing, success, etc.
And so, if I understand it well, one of the things Compso does is that you find the same person in multiple channels. So let's say I have a Slack community and we're active on Twitter. You make it visible, like, oh, this same person engages in multiple channels.
Yeah, building that kind of connecting that whole network around the company so you understand how members are engaging and where they're engaging. And it's one of those interesting things. I'll use an example in our own Slack community. You have a member who's like, wow, this member hasn't been here in 9 months. I haven't seen them around. But I was able to say, oh, actually, they're opening our newsletter and they read our newsletter every week. So they are still a member of our community. They're just not a member in a more obvious way. I think a lot of times there's this kind of divide of members you can see and members you can't see because people engage in different ways.
Yeah, it sounds like it's like an opinionated thing, like a new thing. I think probably the response of many organizations you speak to is this not just the same as marketing? How is it different? What is special about community, and how is that thinking different than what we had before?
Yeah, I think if you say community is marketing, you'll piss off every community manager out there. I think that the big difference is that community is all about breaking down barriers and enabling these many-to-many networks to exist. Traditional business has been very siloed, right? It's like, I want to sell to you, so I reach out to you directly, or I want to market to you, or I want to support you. Whereas community is actually enabling that network to engage with each other and actually build relationships with each other. And when done right, it actually can elevate the product or the company into something bigger. I think you look at like Salesforce with like their Dreamforce community, the Trailblazers, right? That is so much more than Salesforce, the product. And that's because they were able to bring people together and find those shared connections and give people a reason to come together. And that's, marketing doesn't give you a reason to be there. It's just like, please buy our product. It's very different. Whereas community is like, come here and like find shared meaning. And maybe you'll buy our product. Maybe you'll be a better customer because of that. But I've used the line that community has to exist for the sake of community. And I think historically companies have made the mistake of allowing community to get co-opted by marketing or sales or support. And people can see through that, right? Community is not really community if the only purpose is to ask questions and get product help. So community really becomes bigger than marketing when there's a bigger reason than the product to be there.
And so one of the, I think, if I understand this well, one of the important aspects of a community is that beyond direct engagement with the organization, there's engagement between individual community members.
Yeah, and breaking down those barriers and enabling it to happen. I think community building is, people have their different analogies for it, but you're not actually in there like marketing or sales. You are doing those connections yourself. Whereas community is more about building the space in which those connections can happen. Like you're shepherding it rather than manually doing it.
And so, how long has Compso been around?
I guess there's like a double-sided answer to that question. It's about a little under 2 years now, but then we pivoted what we were building as startups do about a year ago. So depending on where you want to define that starting point.
I'm asking you because, thinking about the before times, I remember community used to be this thing where in organizations you had someone that organized events, and then the community was, well, we have a community in Amsterdam and there we have events, and then that's it. And so how has this been for you? Like, community is in your world, I suppose, mostly, if not completely, an online thing.
It wasn't intended to be an online only thing. I think it's just the state of the world in the last year
Yes.
kind of forced the hand. But I think that's one of the beauties and the dangers of community is that it is such a broad thing. You go and ask 10 different people or 10 different companies to define what community means for them, and you'll get different answers. And you can go on Twitter and define it, and half the replies will be people agreeing with you, and half of them will be like, no, that's wrong. This is what community is. And That's like what kind of the great thing about it. It makes it very hard to build a product in the space or give advice in the space, because it's always like, here's the advice on how you build community, except for when that doesn't apply to your community because your community is different.
And so if you're, you're starting a startup, how do you even get started with this? Like I don't know this answer. I know that there's like, we exist in the remote space. There's people that regularly engage with us. I think we're one of your customers as well. But like if I were to start a new company, I wouldn't necessarily know like, this is how I'm gonna get started with a community, other than buying your product and starting to look at it.
I think sometimes, I think historically it happens accidentally sometimes. I think companies that have good products, people gather around naturally. I think you look at like things like Webflow or Notion, people just gathered around them and started sharing Notion templates and things like that. That wasn't something that Notion set out and did intentionally. It just kind of happened. And, now they can build intentional community from there. But I think it's almost like that question. It's a little bit of a loaded question, I think, sometimes, where it's sometimes it's like developers debating what database they should use or what language they should start their project. It's like, it probably doesn't matter. Like it's about finding a reason, once again, for people to be there. It's like, why do people want to join your community, and why do they want to stay there? What value are they going to get out of it? And one of the big differences is, unlike traditional social media or marketing, which is very one directional and very consumption based, right? I can follow you on Twitter. I don't have to actually actively do anything to get value out of that. I can just browse your tweets and see things, and it's kind of delivered to me. Community members have to put in to get out. It's not like you can't just like join a Slack community and just be there and expect value to be delivered to you on a silver platter. So you have to unlock that reason for people to want to be there. And that's the first thing to start with. And I think a lot of startups start with, they put their customers in a Slack channel, and then they try to figure out how to go broader than that. I just use ourselves as an example. We did the opposite. We actually, when we were trying to figure out what our pivot was, we knew we wanted to be in the community space, but we didn't really know what our product was or was going to be, because our first product wasn't working as well as we had hoped it would, as startups do. Yeah. We started a newsletter. It was a Substack. It was just like, here's the best tweets and blog posts in the community space each week. And then we launched a Slack channel and brought, I think we had like 50 people that were reading the newsletter, and like invited them to the Slack channel. And there was no purpose there. It was just like, hey, we're here to talk about community. And then over time, that mission gets more defined and refined, and we're more intentional about it. But that first step is just bringing people together, which is also why it's so hard to get that, because like, that's a very broad thing to do. Unlike sales or marketing, we can be like, hey, do A, then B, then C, then the sale will happen, then this will happen, or whatever. Community is a little bit, it's an art and a science, which is why it makes it very hard to give that sort of prescriptive advice.
So what does the future look like? How are organizations going to react to like the rise of the community or the importance of the community?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot is happening right now. The number of chief community officers we're seeing and VP of community roles, and the number of companies that reach out to us on a weekly basis to ask about community, because they're like, oh, well, we should have started 3 years ago. And because it's one of those things that takes time. Yeah. So it is, that saying, like, the best time to start a community was yesterday. The second best time to start one is today. Like the tree saying kind of is applicable here. I think the future, like I said, I think the old world of community was very like community of support, where community, like you weren't part of a company's community unless you bought the product. Yeah. Then you would join the community, and maybe you're there to ask questions. Like some of them, like Salesforce, have been able to leverage it into like a bigger brand and a bigger thing. But for the most part, you were there to have support questions or get help or give product feedback. And now more and more companies are moving towards this idea of a community of interest, where it's not just for customers anymore, but it's for the entire space in which they exist. So for example, our community, the community club, is not for Commsor customers only. It's a community for community builders. Whether you're a Commsor customer, whether you'll ever be a Commsor customer, whether there's no potential for you ever to be, it's just a space for our space. And I think like Lattice is another good example of that. They have their We Heart People community, which is for people that work in HR and people ops, whether they're a Lattice customer or not. So we're seeing community get broader and broader. And it's almost like this evolution of community, and excuse my like crass language here, being the bastard child of companies, where like different companies like report to different departments and no one really knew where it lived. And now it's maturing into its own department. But I actually think it's going to go one step further and actually start to sit around all those departments and actually be a first touch point rather than a last touch point.
Interesting. Can you elaborate on that? Like sitting around, like it, rather than touch points being marketing, rather than touch points being, a BDR. Well, how do you see that?
Yeah, this is, I guess I'm gonna piss off some community managers if they listen to this, because I know there's some slight disagreement on this, but I think there's kind of two types of community at a company from my perspective. There is the community as is traditionally defined and owned by a community team, the Slack, the forums, maybe the events, maybe the social media, maybe the content team, depending on how community is structured at a company. But that's like the traditional community. But then there's this broader idea of community / customer experience that I think sits one layer higher up, which is if you and I sit here and have a sales conversation about remote and I leave with a terrible experience, that was not on a community channel. That was not a relationship or an interaction owned by your community manager, but that would hurt remote's community, or vice versa. If I had a great experience, it would benefit remote's community. So I think there's this idea that community has that tangible piece, but also this intangible piece that almost sits around the entire network around a company. And it's this idea that community, unlike any other function in a company, has the ability to touch every other function. Once again, it's hard to define. Like the goal of community is kind of everyone's goals and no one's goals at the same time. Community can help drive leads and sales. It can help reduce support costs. It can help increase customer success. It can help drive brand awareness and thought leadership. And there's it can drive hiring. We've hired people from our community. It's like, it's this multifaceted thing that actually can sit around the entire company rather than just being a piece that sits internally.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Now that I'm thinking about it, I think, back when I was at Gitlab, we did everything in public, and part of our secret was everything was in public. And not just that, you can also just contribute and comment on that. And we sort of built a community exactly on top of that. Like it was an open source project, and then once it became a business, we were like, well, we are going to continue operating almost as if we are an open source project. And then we did exactly that. We ended up hiring the community. I think we had like a list of like people that did most of commits, and I think we hired like the top 20 at least, and out of the top 100 we hired also like a significant portion of that. And I'm starting to see now how that really was community building, even though at the time we just,
and like you wouldn't define it as community, right? Because it's not like, I think that's the mistake is so many companies right now, they're like, we are a Slack community, or we are a discourse community, or we are an inside community, whatever. They almost like they take the platform their community is on and they apply that to the identity of the community. But community is not a platform. Community isn't tooling. Community is the relationships and the networks that are built. And that happens intentionally or not, on a platform or not. And that's where like these lines, like there's that ongoing debate of community versus audience. And I actually think that they kind of almost blurred together. If a company does community right, they kind of become one.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Weird question, but what I'm wondering about, should companies have comment sections on their blogs? Like many companies, like Remote, for example, have a content strategy where they regularly publish things. Should we make it easier for people to be active about that, or should we just leave that where it is, as in Twitter or everywhere else?
I mean, I'm going to answer that in a broader sense than like specifically just comments on blog posts, because I think that's a personal decision that has pros and cons. I think it's a thing where companies have sometimes struggled with adopting community, and that's where like, once again, the old world of business was very siloed, right? Like this is the sales relationship, this is the marketing relationship, because sometimes companies are afraid about enabling customers to talk to each other. It's like, what if someone talks about our competitor? What if someone talks shit about us? What if someone says something mean? It's like, well, they're going to say that anyways. It's just they may or may not say it to your face or in a place that you can actually respond to it. And if you make it impossible for someone to say it in a place where you can converse with them about it, that's going to be that much harder to deal with. So I think there's a lot of like one thing, because community is about breaking down those barriers. You want those conversations to happen. It's like, it's kind of counterintuitive. I've told companies like, it's actually okay if someone joins your Slack to bitch about your product. Because guess what? They're going to bitch about it on Twitter if you don't let them join your Slack and bitch about it. And at least if they do it in your Slack, you can respond to it and maybe rectify the situation. And when you deal with those things in public, and you probably experienced this at GitLab, right? When you deal with that in public, people see that. The community sees, wow, someone had a problem. The company dealt with it really well. That actually becomes like you can turn a negative into a positive when you enable it to happen through the community, versus trying to like keep it in these closed doors where it's like, okay, like, I really hate this company and like, I can't go talk on their forum because they're going to ban me. So I'm just going to tell all my friends in private that I hate this company. And the company's never going to know why they're losing all these customers.
Yeah, there was two things that we did at GitLab. One is once we deleted the database and we wrote publicly about it, and we're like, this is where we're working on the problem. Have a look here, which actually turned out to be a really positive thing in the long run, even though it's extremely painful at the time. And the other thing we did is it's good. And again, you're reframing my memories in the sense of like we're doing community work, which is we just responded to every single thing on the internet. Like every time someone would speak about us or about our product, be it positive or negative, we would just respond to it. And especially if someone said something negative, we would be like, okay, that's interesting. This is how we're going to address it. Or, wow, we didn't realize this was, this was not a good feature. This was not a good thing we built. That's very interesting. You're really reframing it as like, oh, that was.
I think there's a lot
work.
of that. There's a lot of that. Like I like to say I've been a community builder for 10 years, unintentionally for 5 years, and intentionally for 5 years. Because the first 5 years I didn't even realize like there's this community aspect happening to what I was doing.
Yeah. How do you think traditional companies are going to perceive this or are going to deal with this? I think part of maybe their fear is, and I think you referred to this, is that you can't really control it. Like you don't have power over it. You can shut down things like that. Maybe you have already had interactions with more traditional, larger organizations.
Yeah, I mean, my short answer to that would be based on the companies that have been reaching out to us and talking about community. I would say they're less afraid now than I would have expected. I think a year ago when we made the pivot originally and we were trying to talk to companies, they were like, this is dumb. Like community is not our problem. And like that tone has changed a lot in the last year. So I think it'll be interesting. I love to point, listen, Salesforce is like the most shining example of a kind of big, boring enterprise company. And they do community really well in a way that people get excited about. Like if Salesforce can get people excited about being part of their community, any company can do it.
Yeah, I'm starting to think about like Microsoft has for many years a lot of different programs also to like empower individuals and make them proud of like they're part of the greater Microsoft community. Yeah, that's very
like IBM has their like advocacy program where they like highlight like the 30 most helpful people, and they didn't. I don't think they even called it a community until recently. They're just like, this is our advocacy program and we're highlighting good people. It's like, no, but that's a community.
And so if I'm a company and I'm like, wow, this sounds really great, I should participate in this. How do I find someone that can build a community? What makes a community builder like you call yourself?
Oh man, that's the $1 million question. There is no official training for community managers, right? I think most community managers I've spoken to fell into it accidentally. They were either doing it. There's a lot, like myself included. A lot of us started by in the gaming world, where you were building like online, I was building like Skype groups and online forums, and it was like Discord servers for like various games you were a part of and things like that. So there's a lot of people start as kind of like community builders from like a hobbyist perspective, like people who are like, they start a subreddit and they're managing it that way and whatnot. And they kind of fall into it. There's also a lot of people that come from a support success marketing role that just kind of, once again, fall into it. It's a hardcore generalist role right now. That is starting to change. We are starting to see some specialization in community roles where it's not just community manager. You actually have like community marketing, community operations, and things like that. But because it's such a hard role to define sometimes, and there's still a side note, a lot of companies that misuse the term. They're like, we're hiring a community manager. Like, that's more of like a Twitter social media manager. But like, or I saw a role the other day that was like, said community manager, and then you read into it and you're like, this is a growth marketer role, and you're just like calling it community manager. So there's a lot of evolution happening right now. I think it's kind of similar to like revenue ops, right? Like revenue operations was not really a role 3 to 5 years ago, and now it's a role, but it took 3 to 5 years and it's still getting defined. So I mean, to answer the original question about like, what does the company do before they even hire someone? I think community isn't necessarily something that every company should do, right? Like when Twitter was new, every company's like, oh, we got to have a Twitter account. It's like, not every company needs a social media necessarily. And it's like, you don't need a community just because it's like the hot new trend. Just like you didn't need to like put machine learning in your product 5 years ago, just because every VC said you should. Yeah. So I think it's this idea of, they have to be ready to commit to the long haul. Community building takes time. It is not unlike other functions. You can't put $1 in and expect to get $2 out in a trackable way right away. It takes time. I've used the analogy. It's like growing an apple tree. You got to find the right place to plant it. You got to plant it. You got to nurture it. You got to water it every day. You got to make sure the deer don't trample it. It takes time. Eventually, maybe a year or two later, it'll be big enough that it's self-sustaining and you only have to maintain it, and it starts bearing fruit. And it'll bear fruit for 100 years, but it'll take 2 years to get to that point. Yeah. So it is a very slow process. I think companies that want to do it right need to hire a dedicated person. And What that dedicated person looks like depends on the kind of community you're trying to build. But far too often I see someone just take like a marketing intern. They're like, hey, like you're the community manager now, have fun. And then 6 months later, they're complaining that the community didn't work. But it's like, I've actually like pitched this idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy of not investing in community properly, where it's like there's a lack of understanding of community, which leads to a lack of being able to measure it, which leads to a lack of understanding the impact of it, which leads to a lack of investment in it properly, which then all feeds back into itself.
And then, and there comes in Compso where you say, well, we can sort of show you at least somewhat what the impact is of.
But even then, I
having a
think
leader.
you still need a person who can like it's because community building. It's not saying you can just like automate or put data behind. Like we like to say, we're not a data driven product. We're a data augmented product. Right? Like we will give a community manager and a community team the data and the insights they need to understand their job and maybe do a better job and not be taking stabs in the dark and prove that impact. But we're not going to engage or build the community for you.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Other than like a cultural shift in how you think about communities, what is lacking still in the space? Like what are you building over the next years to help enable communities being built and help them grow?
I still think there's a lot of, to go back to like the role, there's a lot of the misunderstanding of like what a community role looks like, what you're hiring for. We're no longer the days of, a VC backed startup paying a head of community $50,000 a year to live in San Francisco. That luckily is no longer here, but there's definitely a lot of companies are still undervaluing community and not appreciating the time it takes. So we're doing a lot of work this year on, there's a lot of resources out there for community managers. Like how do you manage a community on a day-to-day basis? How do you engage a community? There's not a lot of resources out there. They're starting to get there, but there's not a ton out there for how do you convince a CEO or a CMO or an investor or another executive to care about community? Like, how do you think about community from an operational and organizational level, not a day-to-day level? So we're doing a lot of focus there because, community managers have been talking amongst themselves for 10, 20 years about people should care about community. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't come down from the top as well, it's going to have limited impact. So we're doing a lot of work there. We actually launched, just to do a little plug here, a thing called C School, which is like a 12-week program to actually train people to be community managers. Because as I mentioned, there isn't really, you can't get a college degree in it. There's books and articles and podcasts and YouTube videos, but there's not a actual like certification program. Like you are ready to be a community manager now. So we're working on building that out and doing a lot of like, I like to say we're not a software company, we're a community company, because half our team works on these sort of initiatives that are more about growing the community space and defining the community space rather than our own product.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Where can people find the C School? It's on your website?
So we have our own community, the community club, as I mentioned, which is like very separate from Commsor and very intentionally separate. So it's under that brand. So if it's community.club, one of those hip new domains.
And Commsor is at commsor.com.
Yeah.
All right, Mac, thanks so much for being on today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks.